Okay, this week we are talking about something a little bit different. We're still in the unit where we're talking about logic and symbolic logic in our parent class. And this sort of falls into that category, but at the same time, it kind of doesn't. So we're looking at informal fallacies in this section. In the parent class, in chapter 3, we talk about logical fallacies. And this is similar, but it's not exactly the same idea. We would refer to those types of fallacies as formal fallacies, where we can represent them symbolically and using truth tables or some other method show that a logical statement or argument is a fallacy. In this case, we're looking at informal fallacies, which are things that turn up in kind of arguments and debates. So I'm going to just give you this disclaimer. This is not going to directly help with the kind of material that we're looking at in the parent class, but I wanted to do this anyways because I felt like this would be a useful thing to look at just for everyday life. We live in an age of misinformation, and these kinds of fallacies I see all the time when people try to make poor arguments. So what we're going to do is look at 4 different informal fallacies, and then your assignment is going to give you some cases where you have to identify what fallacy is being used. Okay, so basically, to summarize all of that, an informal fallacy is basically a poor argument when in some kind of a debate. So the first thing we're going to look at is what's called a straw man argument. And a straw man argument, or a straw man fallacy, is another term for that. It occurs when somebody takes another person's argument and distorts it or exaggerates it in some extreme way, and then attacks the distorted version of their argument instead of the actual claim that the person was making. So here's an example of that. And I'm just kind of reading what I wrote here just to give you the examples. But here's our example. After Will said that we should put more money into health education, Warren responded by saying that he was surprised that Will hates our country so much that he wants to leave it defenseless by cutting military spending. So this is what we call a straw man argument. What was Will's original argument? He said that we should be putting more money into health and education. He didn't say anything about cutting military spending. He didn't make an emotional argument at all. So to come back at him by saying Will hates our country for some reason is a pretty extreme argument to make. Sorry, my dog just wandered in here. I gotta get him out. 1 second. Okay. So that's what we call a straw man. Warren is attacking an argument that Will wasn't actually making. And he was kind of taking it to an extreme level. Okay? Sorry. The next fallacy that we're going to look at is what's called a false cause. So the idea behind a false cause is that you presume a relationship between two things because there's a correlation between them. And let me back that up. False cause is another way of describing what we refer to in statistics as correlation implies causation. So the idea behind a false cause is we look at two things that appear to be related and then make the assumption that one is the cause of the other, which is not necessarily the case. So an example we could look at here, pointing to a fancy chart, Roger shows how temperatures have been rising over the past few centuries. At the same time, the number of pirates has been decreasing over the past few centuries. So his conclusion is that pirates cool the world and global warming is a hoax. So this is obviously a poor argument. This doesn't make any sense. Even though these two things have a correlation, temperature has been rising over the past few centuries and pirates have been decreasing, the number of pirates have been decreasing over the past few centuries, that doesn't mean that those two things are related. If this were a statistics class, we would look at lots and lots of examples of variables, things that appear to have some kind of correlation, but there's no logical cause linking those two things. So that's what we call the false cause fallacy. And again, another word for that is correlation implies causation. The third fallacy that we're going to look at is called special pleading. And another term for this is moving the goalposts. So basically, What this is if somebody proves an argument of yours false, or if somebody successfully argues against you, rather than sort of kind of admitting defeat on that, you do this thing called moving the goalposts, where you try to invalidate their counterpoint in sort of an illogical way. So, in the description here, it says you're kind of making up an exception for why your claim was shown to be false. So here's an example. Edward Johns claimed to be a psychic, but when his abilities were tested under proper scientific conditions, they magically disappeared. Edward explained that one had to have faith in his abilities for them to work. So this is obviously, if you came across this sort of a person in real life, you'd probably assume this guy is a scam artist. He claims to be a psychic, and if you go and you try to test his abilities and find that they don't actually predict what they were supposed to predict, his get out of jail free card, if you will, is to say, well, you never had faith in my abilities and that made them not work. So that gives you no real way of verifying whether his abilities are correct or not, and he's moving the goalposts, so to speak. So that's what we call special pleading, and that's another informal fallacy. The last one that we want to look at is called begging the question. Begging the question is also called circular reasoning. And the idea behind begging the question is that you present what's called a circular argument where your conclusion is included in the premise. And so in our symbolic logic material, we've talked about a premise and a conclusion when forming, formal arguments. And what happens here is that you are assuming the thing that you are trying to prove in your premise, which just kind of creates this circle between premise and conclusion. So an example of that is this. America is the best place to live because it's better than any other country. So here the premise is that the assumption basically is that America is better than any country. Can you prove that? Maybe, but that's not what's being done here. You're assuming it, and then you're using that assumption to prove the same thing that you assumed. America is the best place because it's better than any other country. That's not really a valid argument. So these are 4 informal fallacies: against straw man, false cause, special pleading, and begging the question. There are tons more, like hundreds more. These are just 4 very common ones, but it's an interesting thing to look at, especially, like I said, in this age of misinformation, where online information travels at the speed of light, and people are convinced very easily of very, very poor arguments because they're not really trained or used to seeing fallacies like this. They're not good at picking those things out. So hopefully this is of some use to you in life. It's not going to directly correlate, like I said, to what we were doing in the parent class, but it's still good information to know. So that's going to wrap this up for this week.